Morning at morning, Grace Calf began like any other day. The early sunlight, still faint and cool, slipped through the large front window, casting a diagonal glow across the ash-gray tiled floor. The clinking of spoons against cups, the steady hum of the coffee grinder, everything carried the peaceful rhythm one hopes to find at a cafe at 7 a.m. Michael Foster, wearing a dark khaki jacket and a low-brimmed cap, sat alone at the counter by the wall. He ordered a hot espresso and a slice of buttered toast, quietly jotting notes into a worn notebook. No one paid him any attention. They only saw a man who looked like a regular jotting something down while waiting for his coffee. But Michael's ears didn't rest. Just then, as the espresso machine paused for a brief moment, he heard a sentence so soft it might have vanished into the air. If not for his attention tips today, probably won't be enough to catch the last bus. The whisper came from behind the counter.
Softer even than the hiss of steam from the milk frother.
Michael froze mid-sentence. He looked up. Behind the counter, a young server, thin hair tied in a simple bun, was pouring hot water into a glass carafe. Her face was turned toward the customers, still wearing the usual smile. But her eyes, framed by faint shadows, told a different story. A quiet exhaustion, like someone who had just come through a sleepless night and knew tonight wouldn't be any different. Michael took a sip of his coffee, still holding the guise of an outside observer. But inside him, something began to stir. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they were too familiar, so familiar that he knew when staff begin to say things like that, it means the system has left them alone for far too long. He remained still, but his eyes followed the girl. What was her name? A few seconds later, Michael saw an older regular, slightly hunched, handing her a $5 bill. "This is for you, Megan," he said. The girl, Megan, bowed her head in thanks, quickly took the money, then glanced toward the shift leader standing in the far corner. Almost immediately, she tucked the bill into her apron pocket, eyes scanning the room like someone afraid of being seen. Just a small gesture. But it didn't escape Michael. That was the first mini-twist, the avoidance behavior. She didn't feel safe accepting tips, even ones directly from customers. And the person she seemed afraid of was the coworker standing behind the counter with her all morning. That same coworker just a few minutes earlier had told her to wipe down the pastry shelf again because it wasn't evenly clean. No one else in the cafe noticed. But for Michael, CEO who had built the entire brand from nothing, tiny things like that were never just random. Then he caught another bit of dialogue. A different employee in the same beige uniform as Megan leaned in and whispered as she walked by. "Did you work late again last night?" Megan gave a tired smile. "Gas station shift ended close to 2 a.m. And I still had to open here at 6. Michael set his coffee cup down. That sentence, it cut like a thin blade across his awareness. Sharp. And painful. A young woman working more than one job, still uncertain whether she could afford a ride home. And someone like her, still expected to work politely fast, always smiling just to earn a few tips that she probably never even got to keep. What had happened to the system he once believed was transparent and fair, Michael didn't answer. But from that moment on, his eyes were no longer the eyes of a customer. They were the eyes of a man ready to uncover the truth. One sentence, one pill swallowed without water, one weary smile. 3 details enough to shatter what had seemed like a peaceful morning. Then, as Michael stood up and ordered another slice of toast as if to linger just a little longer, the audience began to understand something was about to change. Morning, Grace location number 18 of the new Dawn Cafe chain sat quietly at the corner where 2 main train lines met. To the left was a bank. To the right, a high school. The name Morning Grace wasn't a coincidence. It was chosen the year the cafe opened, meant to ensure that every customer who stepped inside would begin their day gently, peacefully. But today, the air in the cafe seemed to be hiding something. The sound of the coffee grinder continued steadily. The milk steamer hissed in rhythmic bursts. Customers sat in small groups, mostly office workers, a few young people typing rapidly on their laptops. On the gray tiled floor, the early sunlight streamed through the frosted glass window, casting a quiet sheet of light across the cafe. Michael Foster, in an old khaki jacket with a low-brimmed cap, sat near the pastry case. He had just ordered another egg sandwich, still jotting a few lines in his notebook. But in truth, all his senses were focused on the bar counter where Sophie was working. The young woman named Sophie, about 23, petite hair neatly braided, wore a dark green apron with her name tag lightly dusted in croissant flour. Her face was bright, her smile gentle, and she always treated customers with grace. But Michael noticed something when no one was looking. She often slipped her hands into the apron pockets as if to hide the red welts on her palms. Every time she carried a tray, Sophie winced briefly, then smiled again. And each time a customer left a personal tip, she would quickly count it in a hidden corner, then immediately tuck it into her shirt pocket, glancing toward the right side of the counter. Over there, Brian stood. Brian, the morning shift leader, was around 30, broad-shouldered, with neatly gelled hair. He never touched a cup of coffee. He just watched. In his hands were the shift schedule, a draft payroll sheet, and a large glass jar in front of him, labeled TIPSS TAFFSHARE. But Michael noticed this whenever a customer tried to give Sophie a personal tip. Brian stepped in, quickly speaking just loud enough to hear. "Thanks, just put it in the common jar, please." Not once, but 3 times within 20 minutes. Each time, Sophie only nodded, accepted the instruction, and stepped back. Oscar, the head chef with the calf since the early days. Nearly 50, graying beard, calm demeanor. Michael had met him a few times in internal meetings and knew he was an honest man. But that morning, when Michael asked about staffing, Oscar merely gave a faint smile. "You should ask Brian. I just handle the kitchen." A clear avoidance. Then there was Mr. Charles, the oldest regular in the calf, sitting by the window. He always ordered crispy toast and a cup of mint tea. When he saw Michael glance at Sophie again, he just sighed. "That girl, she's only still here because she needs the money. Not because she loves this job." It sounded like a joke, but no one laughed. Michael gave a slight nod. He didn't ask anything further, but in his mind, the pieces were coming together. Sophie, someone customers often praised, had never appeared on the official staff roster. Brian, the one who assigned shifts, seemed to be controlling the entire tip flow. Oscar, trustworthy, was staying silent. And then there were the little things that revealed so much. A pill Sophie swallowed quickly right after finishing her kitchen shift. The sad look in her eyes when she saw the shift schedule without her name. The brief hesitation as she returned the bill a customer had tried to give her directly. These weren't hard evidence, but they were signs. Michael wrote in his notebook, "Sophie part-time. Why not on payroll?" He knew the internal policies well. Every employee after 3 months of probation must be considered for official hiring. Some don't make the cut, and that's fair. But for someone like Sophie, loved by customers, dependable, why was she still not listed? He looked up again. Sophie was holding a new tray of pastries, turning slowly to avoid spilling. And in that brief moment, Michael clearly saw her right hand was gently wrapped in a bandage. That girl, still smiling, was working in silence. And maybe also in pain. He set his pen down. The next page in his notebook read, "It's not just about tips. It's about someone trying to hold on to her dignity with a smile every morning." No one in Morning Grace Calf noticed anything unusual that morning. But one person from the corner near the pastry case had begun rewriting an entire system starting from these subtle signs. After 9 a.m., the customer flow thinned. Morning Grace quieted down a notch. Michael Foster, still posing as an anonymous customer, ordered another slice of toast and a pot of herbal tea. He jotted a few more lines, but his eyes never left the counter. There, Sophie, the young server with the sad eyes from earlier, was bending down to wipe tables, her motion slower than usual. After finishing the final table, she returned to the counter, pulled a napkin from her apron pocket to wipe her hands, and then, instead of standing up to pour water like she usually did, she quietly sank down behind the counter. Not to rest, but to breathe. She pressed her back against the cold stainless steel cabinet. One hand rested on her stomach, the other clenched the edge of her apron as if trying to keep herself from collapsing. Another employee, likely on the same shift, approached and gently asked, "Skipped lunch break again?" Sophie shook her head. Forced a smile. But her voice, hoarse and faint, made Michael stop writing altogether. Just wish for a day where I can work without fighting for every tip just to survive. No complaints. No drama. Just a truth spoken from the limits of someone who had endured too much. Michael furrowed his brow. His hand tightened around the notebook. Questions now appeared clearly in his mind. Why would a hardworking, punctual, well-mannered employee be in such an exhausted state? What kind of system allowed this to happen without anyone noticing he was about to look away? But then another voice from his left lowered the air even more. She applied to be full-time a few times, said Mr. Charles, the elderly regular near the window, but got rejected. Heard it was because she's not flexible enough. Can you believe that? Michael turned slightly? Charles was looking at Sophie, his eyes sorrowful. Not flexible, Michael repeated in his mind. Someone who works 3 shifts a week, shows up at 6 a.m., often covers for others, not flexible, and then like a cold pair of scissors slicing through every positive assumption. Brian, the morning shift lead, emerged from the prep area, tossed a towel onto the counter, and said loudly, clearly, as if making sure everyone heard, if you can't take it, quit. This place doesn't keep the weak. No one replied.
Sophie stood up.
No protest. No reaction. Just bowed her head and kept pouring a new pot of tea. But Michael saw it in that downward glance. Her eyes had turned red. He picked up his teacup, set it gently onto the saucer.
A simple gesture, but his mind was burning.
The clues he had quietly observed all morning now forming a clear picture. 1. Employees hiding personal tips as if doing something wrong. 2. A shared tip system that wasn't transparent. 3. A team leader who controlled the schedule and could deny opportunities to anyone he didn't favor. There was no doubt anymore. This was the moment Michael knew he could no longer pretend to be a passive customer. Every word spoken didn't just silence Sophie. It made the audience, those following Michael's journey, feel that tightness in their chest. No one deserves to work endlessly fake smiles for customers and still wonder if they have enough money to get home at the end of the day. Michael hadn't stood up yet, but his gaze had changed. And from that moment on, the viewers were no longer just curious about what was happening. They began to hope, how is this going to end? Michael didn't order anything else. He stayed seated near the window, still holding his cup of tea, but taking no further sips. His eyes were no longer passively observing the cafe's rhythm. They were registering meticulously every small detail, how staff interacted, who controlled the tip jar, who was favored, who always looked uneasy. He began chatting, gently like a regular customer making conversation. No pressing questions. No interrupting anyone's shift. Just casual talk between 2 people waiting for their orders. A girl behind the pastry counter named Haley glanced cautiously toward Brian, then whispered, around here, only those who get on the team lead's good side get good shifts. Morning slots, more customers, better tips. If not, you just get thrown around the schedule, end up exhausted, and earn almost nothing. Michael didn't react, just nodded slightly. He noted it down. Every word. A young man collecting dishes from a nearby table, around 20, named Nate, happened to stop by Michael's table to clean. Michael asked, how does tip sharing work around here? Nate looked around, then leaned in and whispered, I've seen Brian split the tips before. But it's weird. The ones who work more get less. The ones who do less get more. Some of us wanted to ask, but never mind. We're afraid of losing our shifts. Michael didn't respond. But inside, it felt like something inside his chest had been stretched. Every joint in the operating system he once trusted was now cracking. He kept his eyes on Sophie. She continued serving with steady hands. Still wore that gentle, practiced smile, right timing, right manner, as if trained to conceal real emotions. But he noticed. Every time she turned her back, every time she bent to lift a tray, she clenched her hand into a fist, as if squeezing herself just to stay upright. Around 11 a.m., near the end of the first shift, Sophie walked into the small back office to collect her weekly estimated paycheck. The door wasn't closed. Michael could see everything clearly from where he sat. She picked up the thin paper, glanced at it briefly, and then she froze. Her shoulders dropped. The hand holding the paper trembled. She stepped backward as if the floor had just slipped beneath her feet. No crying. No tears rolling down. But Michael saw clearer than ever, her eyes reddening and her hands clutching the paycheck like it was proof of something that had been wrong for a long, long time. Sophie didn't return to the counter right away. She sat down behind the pastry rack, a spot where staff would sit briefly if the kitchen wasn't ready. Her back was turned to the customers. But Michael saw her clearly. She sat still. Didn't move. Didn't check her phone. Just silent, as if trying to find her breath again. Another staff member walked past, saw her, but didn't stop. Maybe it wasn't unusual for them. Maybe they'd become too used to someone on the shift falling into quiet despair, then picking themselves up, wiping their own tears, and getting back to work. Michael didn't stand up. He remained seated. But in his mind, he was piecing things together, Brian's comment that morning. The way Brian stopped customers from tipping Sophie directly. Nate's guarded eyes. Haley's cautious tone, and now Sophie, a young server sitting slumped behind the pastry rack, silent because of a single paycheck handed to her. Each small act, each isolated detail, was no longer a meaningless scrap. They were coming together, forming a bigger picture. And that picture wasn't one of a smoothly operating calf. It was a system quietly pushing the vulnerable to the edge, masking injustice with a polite, well-rehearsed fade. Michael felt that he, as the founder, had been blinded. Blinded by revenue reports, growth charts, and praises from loyal customers. He looked at Sophie again. She still hadn't moved. And he knew if he kept pretending to be a regular customer, he would be part of the silence. He took a deep breath. Not to say something just yet, but to prepare for a confrontation that needed to happen very soon. Because from that moment on, the viewers weren't just watching Michael to see what was happening. They were waiting to see, would he do something, and if so, how would he make sure it never happens again? Michael placed his teacup gently on the wooden table and stood up. Not rushed. Not loud. He walked toward the front counter where Brian was still checking new orders printed from the POS system. Everything in the cafe was still running as usual. But on another level, a different rhythm, all eyes slowly began to shift toward him. Michael stood in front of Brian. No shouting. No threats. But his voice, low, steady, deliberate, was enough to shatter the false peace that had blanketed that morning. I'd like to ask who is responsible for how tips are distributed here. Brian looked up, eyebrows slightly furrowed. His eyes scanned Michael, cautious.
Sorry, and you, our Michael, didn't answer immediately.
Instead, he turned slightly, glancing to the left side of the counter where Sophie was wiping a table, head lowered. The cloth in her hand was frayed at the edges, soaked in water and streaked with coffee stains. Her hand trembled lightly, every motion looking like it borrowed from the last ounce of strength she had left. Michael turned back, his eyes fixed directly on Brian. Just someone who doesn't understand why an employee who worked a full shift, stood all morning, still has to walk home. A silence wrapped around the space, and even more why she burst into tears just from looking at a payslip. In an instant, the entire cafe seemed to freeze. The coffee grinder still ran, but the whirring noise felt like it had been swallowed by the air. An employee carrying a tray paused, eyes darting between Michael and Brian.
A customer reading a newspaper lowered its eyes, locked on the counter.
Oscar, the longtime chef, peeked out from the kitchen door, his expression wary. Brian said nothing, but his body stiffened as if bracing for something. Michael didn't accuse. He let the words linger just clear enough for everyone to understand, yet light enough to force reflection. Then came an emotional drop, sudden and raw, as Sophie walked toward the counter carrying an empty tray. She stopped when she saw Michael standing there facing Brian. She didn't speak, but her eyes, red though dry, looked at Michael with a kind of astonishment that couldn't be named. Michael didn't look at Sophie, but he knew she was there. He could feel her presence anchoring the entire atmosphere. And what kept the viewers watching wasn't the anticipation of someone being fired, but the hope that something right would finally be said. Right here. Right now. Brian swallowed. He adjusted his posture, deflecting, "We just follow protocol." Each location has its own way of managing things. Michael kept his voice gentle, but his gaze grew colder, managing for whose benefit at that moment. Oscar stepped fully out of the kitchen, leaning near the entrance. Mr. Charles, the regular, shook his head quietly, saying to the person beside him, "Finally, someone's asking that question." Another silence swept across the space. But this time, it wasn't waiting. It was foretelling that what came next would permanently shift the air inside Morning Grace Cafe. Michael pulled his phone from the pocket of his coat. He didn't make a call. He opened an internal New Dawn app, a system that stores shift logs, tip distribution records, and anonymous staff feedback. He raised the screen for Brian to see. "Are you sure you want me to start pulling this data right here at the counter?" Brian didn't respond. And that silence was the only answer Michael needed. Not everyone lies with words. Some lie through silence. But that silence roars in the hearts of those watching. At the far end of the cafe, a young female employee walked in unaware of what was unfolding. She paused, looked around, then turned away as if she'd seen this scene before in another place at another time and knew how it usually ends. But this time, something was different. Michael Foster, the founder of New Dawn Cafe, was here, and he wasn't standing to play the role of director. He was standing to restore something that should never have been forgotten. Kindness in every cup of coffee, fairness in every hour of labor, integrity in every dollar left in the tip jar without expecting a thank you. Michael set the phone down on the counter and looked at Brian one more time. "We will talk, but not here. I want you to prepare every log for shift schedules, tip allocations, and timekeeping records from the past 3 months. Deadline within the next 3 hours." He turned back to his seat without another word. But everyone in the cafe, from Sophie to Oscar, from the new hire to the elderly customer, understood a silence had just been broken. And what was about to happen would not resemble any morning before at Morning Grace.
Michael slowly walked toward the counter once again.
This time, he didn't ask. He pulled from his wallet a small metallic card, shining silver under the ceiling lights. "Michael Foster," he said, articulating each word. His voice wasn't loud, but its tone was commanding. "I'm the founder of New Dawn Cafe." The atmosphere inside Morning Grace shifted instantly. No one moved. Even the usual clinking sounds of the morning seemed to vanish. Every eye locked onto the man who had just gone from an ordinary customer to someone they had all heard of but never expected to meet in person. Especially not here. Sophie stood frozen behind the counter, the cleaning cloth in her hand stiffened. Brian opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Oscar, the chef, who rarely lifted his head, was now staring directly at the company founder, his expression unreadable. Michael didn't linger on titles. He turned to the technician standing near the espresso machine. "I need you to activate the internal cameras. Right now." One click. The screen mounted high in the corner of the cafe lit up, replaying footage from that morning. In the crystal clear frame, a customer handing a tip to Sophie, eyes full of sympathy. Sophie bowed in thanks, preparing to tuck it into her pocket. But Brian, just seconds later, stepped in, collected all the money, and dropped it into the communal tip jar at the center of the counter without a word. Next came a brief clip from the break room camera. The shift schedule appeared, every name printed clearly except Sophie's. Not a single entry with her name for the entire week. She had shown up every day, worked full hours. But on paper, it was as if she didn't exist. Brian's eyes darted repeatedly. Panic began to rise in his gaze. "That's how this branch operates." He tried to stay calm. "We're allowed to make flexible decisions depending on the situation." Michael cut him off, not waiting for him to finish. "No, the policies come from me." His voice wasn't raised, but it hit like a gavel. And in every regulation of the New Dawn system, there is no clause that allows a manager to strip an employee of the value of their labor. Sophie stepped back. Her eyes welled up, but she bit her lip, not letting a single tear fall. Michael stepped closer, pointing at the screen that isn't a situation. That's a choice. You chose to sweep private tips into the shared pool. You chose not to list her name on the schedule. You chose to turn your back on what we call the core fairness. A quiet clink echoed. Mr. Charles gently set his coffee cup on the table. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave Sophie was a quiet confirmation she hadn't imagined it. She wasn't weak. She had been right to feel something was wrong. Brian grasped at one last defense. I was just doing what some other branches do. I thought you thought, Michael repeated, tilting his head slightly at Brian as if he were a stranger. You thought you could redefine this company's values based on ambiguity and personal control, a single beat of silence? Then Michael turned toward the entire staff, those behind the counter in the kitchen at the far end of the hallway leading to the back door. I won't ask who knew and who didn't. I'll let what has happened this morning be the evidence. But starting today, this place will no longer be somewhere that makes anyone cry over their paycheck. Sophie gave a quiet sob. For the first time that morning, she raised a hand to wipe her eyes. Michael looked at her, not with pity, not with comfort, but with the gaze of someone who understood she didn't need saving. She needed to be seen. And now she had been seen. He nodded toward the technical staff. Save the entire footage. Send it to me by today. I'll continue working with HR. Brian stood frozen, as if the slightest touch would cause everything to collapse. And maybe it would. Michael turned around, walking back to his original seat. As he passed by, every employee avoided his eyes, not out of fear, but because they were experiencing something they never thought possible. Someone had spoken up for them. Right here. In the very place where they believed no one was listening. The story wasn't over yet. Just 15 minutes after the truth came to light, an urgent email was issued from New Dawn's headquarters to the entire HR system, temporarily suspend the branch manager at Morning Grace pending full investigation into internal policy violations. Brian, once the person who controlled every breath of the calf, now stood silently by the espresso machine, hands still in his pockets. But this time, no one looked at him with fear or caution. They looked at him like a chapter finally closed. At the counter, Sophie was invited into the small office behind to sign her official employment contract. Michael stood there watching as she signed each line. He said nothing. But his gaze, steady, resolute, was the strongest promise of all. I want her to receive all back pay that was and a bonus. Not because she endured, but because she never gave up.
Sophie nodded, lips trembling.
The pen in her hand shook slightly. But this time it wasn't from worry. It was because for the first time in 8 months, she knew her effort hadn't disappeared into silence. Michael stepped outside and stood before the entire staff.
Starting today, real-time tip tracking will be implemented at Morning Grace, he declared.
Whoever serves, receives. All data will be transparent by shift, by transaction. A small digital display was installed above the bar showing each receipt table number and corresponding tip. Staff could monitor it live during their shift. No more foggy glass jars. No more just leave it here. On the wall behind the espresso machine, a small wooden sign was mounted. The words were carefully engraved, painted in soft brown on a light background. No cup of coffee is brewed with tears. No explanation was needed. Everyone understood. At noon, Michael stepped out of the caf.
Sunlight eased down the street, filtering through the glass, casting a long shadow on the old tiled floor.
Before leaving, he stopped by a corner where Sophie was now sitting. No apron. No shrinking posture. She wore a new uniform, a crisp white shirt name tag neatly pinned to her chest. In front of her was a tray of sandwiches and a glass of orange juice, her first proper staff meal after months of surviving on tap water and scraps from the kitchen. Michael saw something crystal clear. She wasn't eating in a hurry. She ate slowly, as if savoring every second she had fought to earn.
Sophie looked up,
Met his gaze, and smiled, this time not to please a customer. But because she had stepped out of the shadows, no one applauded, no one cheered, but the change, real deep and lasting, had begun. Not through promises, but through a new system. Not through emotion, but through concrete action. That story, simply put, is everything that gives comfort to the audience. Because in every breakfast spot, every cafe chain, every place where people work, there might be an injustice unfolding in silence. And maybe someone like Michael Foster is sitting quietly at a corner table observing, not to inspect, but to fix what isn't right. By the time the video ends, viewers don't just see EO. They see themselves every time they were overlooked, every drop of sweat never acknowledged now being given back its dignity.